Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome back, everybody, to the I Thought You'd Like to Know show. This is Pat Flynn. I am delighted for our guest this evening, somebody who I've gotten to become, I would say, pretty good friends at this point. What about it, Dr. Vost? Can we?
I agree, and it's been my pleasure, too.
Yeah, so you've been on my podcast, The Pat Flynn Show, a number of times, but this is the first time that you're joining me here. So I think perhaps just a brief, who I am, what do I do type of thing is in order. So, what's the elevator pitch for Dr. Vost?
Basically, I'm an old retired guy. I'm not sure what I should add to that.
Who writes a lot of books.
Yeah, there you go. No, my name is Kevin Vost. I'm from Springfield, Illinois. I was trained as a clinical psychologist. I did retire from the disability evaluation field a couple of years ago. I did that work for Social Security 32 years. I was also a college professor on the side for psychology and gerontology, study of aging. My own background, I was raised a Catholic, spent about 25 years considering myself an atheist. Came back to the church through the stirrings of the Holy Spirit and the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas in the year 2004. And since then, I've kept busy writing Catholic books, kind of using the knowledge that God was setting me up with during all these years of atheism. Little would I know they would someday be put in service of the church, but that's kind of how it's worked out.
Yeah, it's funny, and part of the reason I was so eager to talk to you at first is so much of your story paralleled my own. And I'm like, whatever this guy learned, I need to learn more of it. And I always benefit from our conversations, and I'm sure I'm going to benefit from this one. You do tremendous work. I love all of your books. I'm looking forward to both the one we're going to talk about today, your upcoming Aquinas book. Now, this one, Memorize the Latin Mass. As we were saying before we went live, as a fairly recent revert to the Catholic faith and the Church, and as somebody who was very post-Vatican II to begin with, the Latin Mass is something that I have yet to experience, something that I do not know all that much about, but I'm very curious about, have been trying to study more and more. So I'm going to have a million questions for you, but let's start at the beginning. So you already wrote Memorize the Mass. You already wrote Memorize the Faith. Why this one now? Why Memorize the Latin Mass? What's the history of this book?
Sure. And it starts in the background with my general psychological background. My specialty area was memory, and I realized through research that some of the great Catholic doctors of the Church, especially St. Thomas Aquinas and his teacher, St. Albert the Great, wrote about these particular memory improvement techniques, and they endorsed them, considering memory an important part of the virtue of prudence or practical wisdom. So anyway, I did write some books about these memory techniques, applying them to catechetical information. And one day, a few years after my first memory book came out, I received an email from an Air Force pilot out in California, an experimental fighter pilot, and he asked me if I could give him some tips on memorizing the Mass. Actually, I'd written a brief article for some website years before on the topic, giving some general suggestions, but I couldn't track that down myself on the Internet, couldn't even find my own Word document. But I was intrigued by his question when he gave me the reason for it. He said he had come across the story of an Admiral Jeremiah Benton, who at the time of the Vietnam War in 1965, in fact, July 18th, we're coming up to the anniversary, 1965, he was shot down over Vietnam and spent nearly 8 years as a prisoner of war, the prisoner of the Viet Cong. Mm-hmm. And many times he was in solitary confinement. He wrote a book about this called Hell is in Session. But he said the one thing that really maintained his sanity during this time was that every day he would recite the Mass to himself in Latin and in English. And in that time, 1965, he would have meant the English translation of the Latin Mass, the traditional Mass. You know, so that's the sort of sanity. And it wasn't a year after I heard that story that a marrying old priest came to my own parish and told about a Bishop James Walsh who was confined by the Chinese communists for 12 years, 1958 to 1970. And he also said that it was the daily recitation, mental recitation of the Mass, along with the rosary, that helped him preserve, you know, his sanity during this time of confinement. I thought, you know, how intriguing, you know. So we came with the idea for the book, Memorize the Mass.
How intriguing is right. I mean, what an incredible story. I mean, something that would have certainly probably have broken most people, if not, you know, at least very much caused them to question their faith. It was having such a deep hold of the faith that preserved them through this atrocity.
That's exactly right. You know, I mean, it could have certainly broken a person, the experience itself, but that strengthened them, gave them that fortitude, you know, to go on because of the holiness of the Mass there. So we subtitle that first book, Memorize the Mass, How to Know and Love the Mass as If Your Life Depended on It. Of course, for Admiral Denton and Bishop Walsh, in a sense, their literal lives did, but in some sense, for all of us, you know, our eternal life depends on that Mass, that great gift that God has given us to draw closer to Him. So anyway, the first book, Memorize the Mass, arose from this, you know, question, this email from this fighter pilot, and my publisher, Dr. Sebastian Mahfoud, suggested that we address both the new Mass and the Latin Mass in that book, which I thought was a wonderful idea. Now, a year or so after that book was out, Memorize the Mass, I received another email. This time not from a fighter pilot, but from a very devout grandmother who described herself as a traditional Catholic with many children and grandchildren. I believe she might have had some great-grandchildren. And she wondered if I would produce a book exclusively on the Latin Mass, this time for people who are raising their children within that tradition. So it would be totally focused on that, and I thought that sounded like a very nice idea. So we fashioned the book Memorize the Latin Mass. So it does incorporate much of the material in the second half of the first book, Memorize the Mass, but it has further embellishments on the Latin Mass, and also another appendix, a new appendix, that draws on what's called the last gospel, passages from the Gospel of John that come at the end of every traditional Latin Mass, and we kind of take it on from there. But anyway, for me, these Mass books have a special significance and meaning because they were prompted, you know, by questions and suggestions from readers of previous books.
You know, and what a wonderful thing too to have this spiritual tool, almost a spiritual weapon in some ways that might make sense in the context that some of these people were in, to provide you that comfort and sanity, because you never know when you're going to need it or how stressful those situations might be. So having these, you know, whether it's the Rosary, the Mass, or the Latin Mass, like really ingrained into you. I can only see immense benefit coming from that, and as somebody who does my very best to make it to daily Mass, I find your work particularly useful, and that kind of, I think, segues into some of the memory techniques, if we can talk about that, because I know one of the techniques that you discuss, and that is in this book as well, is that we should try to, and I'll probably mess this up, so get ready to correct me, right? we should try to memorize things that we are inspired or passionate about, right? And we should also reflect upon them and repeat them often, I think, if I've been studying your work correctly, right? But there's other techniques that we need to know as well. Maybe we could go over some of those.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. I thought that there was from my end, I'm hearing somewhat of an echo.
Yeah. I wonder if that is that me?
Let's see. Let me shut down.
Sometimes a radio station bounces a few things back.
Just 1 second here. Sorry about that. Yeah, everything on the internet shut down, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's the internet. You know how that is.
Oh yeah, I mean you talk about an incredibly sharp double-edged sword. There's the internet. It's so extremely valuable, but so often prone to problems too.
Yeah, you stake so much on it, and then right when you do, it strikes the other way.
Yeah, it does. And and if this persists, I'm just kind of slowing down a bit, so hopefully people can still make out what we're saying.
Yeah, I can hear you okay. Can you hear me all right?
I sure can. I just hear a bit of echo on my own end.
Okay, yeah, you sound clear on my end, so we will just assume that people hear it as angelically as I do.
Okay, I hope so.
So just to kind of repeat what I was saying before is that we start with these memory techniques, and I've found your work particularly interesting because I am so inspired about the Mass, and I think that is one of the techniques that Aquinas promoted, right, is we should try to memorize things that we're obviously passionate about, right? That isn't all the techniques, but that was one that stood out to me because, well, that just seems like it makes sense.
Yeah, it sure does. Especially in our day when we sometimes think, well, why should I memorize anything? I just look on my phone or look it up on the computer, but there can be a world of difference between, what you really internalized and know in your own head and your own heart over something that you can just, access through an instrument there. And it's some of the things that really are worth knowing. I mean, certainly the Mass ranks up there high on the list. And I'll say, too, with these memory techniques, that do come down from St. Albert, St. Thomas. They adapted them. Ancient Greeks and Romans wrote about them before Thomas and Albert, but Thomas and Albert clarified them and endorsed their use for us as Catholics. But the general approach, just so people know, to these Memorize the Mass books is not to overwhelm anyone. So we're not saying, you read this slim book and you'll memorize every word from every prayer. Even the ancient memory experts distinguish between what they called memory for things and memory for words. In memory for words, they meant verbatim recall, like you would remember every word of a prayer or a Bible verse, and that the method is not adapted primarily for that, though it can be used for that. The main thing they called memory for things, but in those things are key concepts that can bring a whole lot of words with them. But the idea is that in this case, it may not be so necessary to know every single word for you to meditate upon, but to know the key concept or idea. So those key concept or ideas we have in Memorize the Latin Mass are the main rites of the Mass, from the time the Mass starts to the very end. And in the book, I give you 42 of these rites. And I pulled them from, I found in the New Mass some different missalettes. I mean, I actually already number them. The New Mass one that I use is St. Joseph's Missal, goes from 1 to 32, from the introductory rites to the last rite. But I found a wonderful book by a Benedictine from the 19th century, Dom Prosper Geringer, a book on the Mass. And he didn't specifically number the Latin Mass, but he had section headings for the different rites, and I counted them up and had 1 to 42, and I thought that was a nice rendering of the Mass. So that's what I used in organizing Memorize the Latin Mass. So if you do go through those 42 rites, you're going to have a pretty good feel for what goes on through the Mass. And the Mass itself, too, the technique involves using visual images and a special system for ordering and organizing, so you know exactly where you are. You'll know, which rite is the 12th and which one is the 20th, and where you are at any time in the Mass, because these techniques also help you organize and know things in exact order.
So before we go into a few specific examples, maybe we could go back and explain the techniques in general, because I think that there were 4 steps at the beginning of your book, if I remember rightly, which one hopes would remember rightly after reading a book on memory. Right.
That's right.
One is the use of uncommon imagery, right? That's the first one? And then maybe you could just go through some of these techniques, or if I'm missing any, so people kind of have the general idea of the approach that they'd be using before we get into some examples of how they apply to the Mass.
Sure. Now, let people who might be interested know these 4 techniques. St. Thomas called them 4 things, whereby a man perfects his memory.
Mm-hmm.
He lists them in his great Summa Theologica, the second part of the second part, the 49th question, the first article, and it's called Whether Memory is a Part of Prudence, prudence or practical wisdom. So there in just a page or so, he gives us these 4 things. And I won't give you in the exact same order he did, but I'll give you the 4. Because 2 of these everybody knows already. If you want to remember something, you've got to be passionate about it, you have to concentrate on it, you have to focus. So we all know that. Even with these special techniques, you have to focus, get rid of distractions, and zoom in. Another thing, you need to rehearse or repeat what you really want to know well. The ancients used to say, repetitio est mater memoriae, or repetition is the mother of memory.
Mm-hmm.
So, first thing, concentrate. Second thing, repeat, rehearse. We already know those. But these 2 elements to the special art of memory. The first is to employ visual images, something you can picture in your mind's eye when you want to remember something. And Thomas says to do this even for abstract ideas, like if it was for virtue or some kind of article of faith or precept or rite of the Mass, you can take something abstract, convert it into some kind of physical image that you can picture, and it will remind you of that abstract image more effectively than the abstract concept itself, because he says, well, that's just how our minds operate. The first thing we come in contact with in the world is what comes in through our senses, what we can see, what we can hear. Then it works its way through that great God-given gift of the intellect, but it starts through the senses. So he's saying, so when you use your senses, form striking mental visual images that'll help you remember things. And we'll probably flesh this out a little bit, in a little bit, to really give a sense of what I'm talking about here. But
and I remember in your first book, something that has stuck with me, again, a testament to your work, was to make the images striking, perhaps even absurd or silly or something like that. So the thing that immediately popped in my mind was when you gave prudence 3 faces. It's a silly image, it's absurd, but it's kind of hard to forget, but there's meaning behind it, right? The 3 faces of prudence, using the wisdom of the past to make a good decision in the present for a better outcome in the future. And as soon as you presented it that way, I haven't forgotten it since.
Well, it's great, and I'm so happy to hear that. And sometimes they can be very, very simple. Like in the first book, Memorize the Faith, we go through the books of the Bible, and some of these are illustrated as they are in the Latin Mass book. And I remember for the book of Jeremiah, the illustrator drew a large bullfrog on a pool table, which happened to be this location that we used. But Jeremiah was there. The bullfrog was there to remind us of the book of Jeremiah. If people are familiar with that classic rock song, Jeremiah was a bullfrog. So some of these things can be that simple. There's your physical image, a frog, and we're using that to remind us of the glorious, book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. And I can give you just one more relevant to the Latin Mass, because this is one that our illustrator drew for us. And it's kind of great, because all my memory books, even with different publishers, we got the same illustrator, a man named Theodor Schluenderfritz, that just does wonderful, whimsical work. But in this one, let me make sure I find this right one here, the page. It shows like a criminal in the old-fashioned striped outfit, the black and white stripes.
Mm-hmm.
And he's fitting this hat on this donkey. But this donkey looks exactly like Eeyore, if people are familiar with the Winnie the Pooh story.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have here, he's kneeling down, fitting this hat on this donkey Eeyore. And this is just to remind us of the second rite of the Latin Mass called the Confiteor, where we say, I confess to Almighty God. So con, the criminal there, convict, fitting the hat on Eeyore, Confiteor. So we can have something as simple, as that, and hopefully humorous, and silly, but it can remind us of something profound. But once you see that image, you're not likely to forget it. It's a little easier to grasp than perhaps an unfamiliar Latin term of Confiteor.
So here's a question. When people are trying to apply these techniques, do you feel that they have more success if they try to come up with the images themselves or borrow other images from others, or does it sort of depend on the context or situation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Pat, because ideally the images that are going to work best are the ones that occur to you. But it can take some effort and practice before you're able to form these images. So what I try to do, I try to give people all kinds of examples of images that came to me, so they have something there they can readily work with, but also then to get into practice, well, what might have I used instead of that? Because, yeah, the ones that make the connections to you, if you're forming your own images, tend to work the best, but I also try to give so much guidance and instruction that you find it easier at some point to come up with your own images. In fact, in the history of these memory techniques, like back in the ancient Latin books and books through the Middle Ages, they used to say, you want people to develop these abilities themselves, so you just give them, maybe 2 or 3 examples, and then they go from there. Well, this became frustrating to historians because we really didn't have much in the way of concrete examples to work with because the books were so sparse. So in my memory books, I try to give dozens and dozens of examples. Now you see all these, now you can take it and run with it. But I should say too, Pat, before I forget, that I believe we were given those 4 things, and I think I got stuck on 3.
That's right. There's one more.
Yes, concentration and a repetition and the forming of images. But when we want to know things in their exact order, like in a list, if you wanted to know the 10 Commandments and wanted to know which one was which, or if you wanted to know the steps of some process, if you were studying something in biology or the way the organs, which organs activate in puberty, or all kinds of things, you want to know their exact order. And Thomas said, so that's the 4th step in perfecting your memory, is having some kind of system of ordering or organization. And the technique that I use in the Memorize the Mass and Memorize the Latin Mass is talked about in the oldest Latin memory book we have. It's estimated to have been written in about 84 BC. It's called the Ad Herennium. It just means it was for a person named Herennius. We don't know exactly who Herennius was, and it was long thought to have been written by Cicero. Now we think for various reasons he probably didn't write it, though it's very consistent with another book he wrote that did talk about these techniques there. But in that book from 84 BC, the first example it gives of an ordering system is a house. What do you know better than like your own house? So that's one of the main systems I use in these memory books, and that is used in Memorize the Mass and Memorize the Latin Mass. So like the rites just start like enter in the front door of somebody's house. That's where we find our image for the first rite. The second rite is just a doormat when you step inside. You just kind of work your way through an entranceway, a foyer like in a modern house, and there you place the image to remind you of all these beautiful rites of the Latin Mass. And I should say, too, another common technique people use, for religious purposes, is not to use a house, but to use a church. You may know your own church very well. You can lay out this location grid, but I will just say I chose in the Mass book not to use the church itself because I didn't want to spur, possible confusion, because maybe an image would then show up in the back of the nave that actually takes place in the Mass on the altar, So to avoid confusion, I have the Mass placed just inside the normal places of a modern house.
So could we draw out a few examples of what this might look like? Either let's use the Latin Mass so we could maybe help to start to understand that as well in relationship to these techniques.
Sure. Let me just give you an example how we kind of get started here. For the Latin Mass, let's see.
And just to interject one more time real quick, I remember going back to the prudence thing that really helped for me, where I actually didn't go and invent my own images because I thought yours worked so well, was just picturing the virtues sitting around the dinner table, and just the order around the dinner table was simple enough that it helped me commit the 4 cardinal and the 3 theological to memory almost right away.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that, because And for some, like speaking of the virtues or the sins, I mentioned the sin of pride, and I say you could picture, here you're in my living room here, and you see the statue of me in there. Does that suggest pride? I have a statue of myself, right? I say, or you could picture the statue surrounded by a pride of lions. Mm-hmm. I said, or if you know the singer Charlie Pride, you could place him there. Mm-hmm. You know, so any of these will work if they trigger for you if they remind you of pride. And the same with these rites of the mass. I'm sorry, but yeah, I do try to give memorable ones myself. But if for some reason one doesn't jibe with you, you can feel free to make your own there. But that is another thing too. We try to make most of these kind of unusual, either just shocking or really big or out of place or funny. Because the mundane things that we see in everyday life, we're more likely to forget. We remember things that are more striking and unusual, and we see this method sometimes used, even by Christ himself. We read in the Gospels where he talks about, a camel passing through the eye of the needle, or swallowing a camel and spitting out a gnat. We see some of these kind of just exaggerated phrases that once you hear them, you're going to hang on to that image.
So just some simple techniques to maybe help people get started with this before we see how you apply it to the Latin Mass. Because I'm sure like any other skill, it gets easier to form these images the more you actually practice it. What are some ways that people could make the images more striking? I mean, the first one that comes to my mind is just making something preposterously large or big or something like that. Do you have any other simple tips of ways that people could kind of stretch or magnify an image in some way to perhaps make it a little bit stickier?
Yeah, sure, and you're right. The size is one thing. One example I sometimes give is these techniques can be used for mundane things like your grocery list if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. And you imagine, you're opening your front door and you get a giant banana punches you in the nose, right? Because it's easier to remember a giant banana that punches you in the nose than a normal banana sitting there, right? So yes, you're right. Size is one thing. Another element can be humor. That involves some kind of a pun or something or a fun image. Like I mentioned, we used the bullfrog for Jeremiah was a bullfrog, things like that. So something that has humor. Also something that has an action, that the figure is doing something that has special relevance to you. Like one of the rites we remember is the Gloria. And I say if you happen, maybe your mom's name Gloria, or you're a great friend of yours or your wife. So in that case, use her, because there's a special significance to you. You're really going to remember that. So there's all kinds of techniques. Again, some things like exaggerate the size, make them funny, make them active, give them some kind of personal relevance to you.
Yeah. So let's dive into the Latin Mass then a little bit. What would be the first thing that we should attempt to memorize with regards to the Latin Mass, and how do you what images or examples do you kind of link this to?
Sure. I'll give you just an example, kind of how, because I do set these books up as a completely guided tutorial. I'm going to take you step by step through every rite. Give you the image, have you imagine it. We'll even rehearse it, maybe we'll even do it backwards. But let me give you an example. Here's how we start after my background on the memory house itself, okay? So you're at this memory house. You knock on the front door, which is location number 1. And there's also going to be a picture of this door on the next page, right? And since there's no electric doorbell, and the reason for that is we're in the old Mass now. We're pretending we're before the time of electricity, right? It's a little just extra reminder. And to your surprise, you are greeted by old King David himself. You can tell by the crown on his head and the slingshot attached to his belt that that's David, right? He blesses you with the sign of the cross, and then oddly enough, he asks you to judge him, bellowing out, "Adjudicate me." Okay, there's number 1, and I'll elaborate in a bit. Now, moving inside to our familiar doormat, and I say familiar because earlier in this book we came across it. You spy an even stranger scene. A convict, you can tell by his black and white striped jumpsuit, or orange if you prefer, kind of a newer model, is fitting a similar garment on Winnie the Pooh's donkey friend Eeyore. Odd indeed, but you'll soon see the reason behind the madness. And I'll give you just one more. Looking back out through the glass panel next to the door, which is number 3, you notice that the front yard has been completely enveloped in a cloud of incense. And then we kind of go on through these numbered things. You see the picture. Oh, yeah, there's the front door, number 1. There's the doormat, number 2. There's that glass panel through which we look out at the front door, And we go through here through 10 different locations in this foyer, but then we reveal later what those things reminded us of. For example, that at the front door we saw King David, right? He signs a cross and says, "Adjudicate me." That is a reminder for the first part of the Latin Mass, the judica me, what is referred to in the Latin, which actually means, adjudicate or judge me. So I'll say, this image cannot fail to bring to mind the first part of the Latin Mass known as the judica me. The first rite takes place right after the priest declares the sign of the cross. Remember, that was in our image too. In Latin, and says, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. And then he goes on, but what this is, the first words of the judica me do mean judge me, and they come from actually Psalm 42 spoken by King David. He says, "Judge me, O God, and distinguish my cause from the nation that is not holy. Deliver me from the unjust and deceitful man." Then he goes on saying, "I will go into the altar of the Almighty God." So in this first rite of the Mass, we're remembering King David going up to the altar as the priest goes up to the altar now before our eyes, to make this sacrifice of the Holy Mass. I think, so it's calling to mind, this silly image of David answering our front door is calling to mind this profound rite that has its roots in the Old Testament, in the Psalms. Now then, moving on to our second image, if you remember we had that con-fitting ear, we talked about it earlier. Mm-hmm. That's just to remind us of it's kind of a verbal pun, a verbal reminder. The system is called the keyword method, when you use English words that sound like a foreign language word that will call it to mind. So confits eor reminds us of confiteor, and confiteor in Latin means, I confess. And we know a version of this from our new Mass. I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters, and so on. Though in the Latin Mass, there's actually an older and more elaborate version where we also mention the Blessed Virgin Mary, Michael the Archangel, and so on. So in essence, for each of these rites, we kind of start with these images. I make sure you can really picture them. They really stand out. You won't forget them. And then we go through and explain, now this is what this image was designed to remind us of. And here is some of the history. This is where this rite came from in the Bible. Or this is the time in church history where this became a part of the Mass. So Pat, I should point one thing out, because sometimes people will think, oh my gosh, we're using these kind of silly images to help us memorize these profound holy things. And let me give you a parallel from Admiral Denton's story. At the time before he was an admiral, when he was this downed pilot in the concentration camp. He was there with some other American prisoners, and they often kept them separate. They wouldn't let them communicate. Even if they put them together in the same truck, side by side, going somewhere, they weren't allowed to talk. So they worked out a system where they would tap each other's knees in Morse code so they could talk to each other, without opening their mouths. And the guards didn't know what was happening. In fact, in an even more famous incident, the Viet Cong brought Denton on to try to use him for propaganda purposes. And while he was on the screen in a video that was going to be sent out to the world, he kept blinking his eyes. And people later realized he blinked the word torture in Morse code to let the world know that, yes, our prisoners were being tortured there. So it's amazing. So I'm saying, he uses Morse code as just some simple code, some eye blink, but it spoke of things so much more deep and important. So I say this is in some sense the parallel of these memory techniques. They're nothing grand in and of themselves, but if they can remind us of the rites of the Mass and their meaning and their history, then they're really serving a noble purpose.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, why I think this is such a great study, is you're not just learning the practice itself, you are learning the history behind it. The Mass is essentially the Bible being acted out. So that's one of the reasons that I've taken such a fascinated interest in your works, and why I'm really excited to dive into this one, because, like I said, the Latin Mass is still somewhat new to me. It's something I'm very interested in. So first off, there are 42 of these illustrations in order in the house when you go through this, correct?
That's right. You're going to see the locations, every one illustrated, every part of each of the room as you work your way through the house. You go through a foyer and a living room and a dining room and a family room, just like you would in a normal modern house. All those locations are illustrated, and believe me, those locations then they become like a mental notepad. And the images you place on them are like the ink or like the writing. Mm-hmm. And once you know those locations, you can use them again and again, over and over, for other purposes. In fact, when I go out and give talks, all my talks take place inside this memory house. I don't use any notes because I can put all my key points in order. But yes, as you go through the book, all the locations are illustrated. We do the rites one by one. We also break them down into chunks, so you're never memorizing 42 things all at once. It's 10 or 7, or 8 things at a time, so it's manageable. Then at the end of the book, we do give a master table where you can see all the rites together, what images we used for them, in what order they are in the Mass. So it's the intention is to make it very thorough, to give you a good feel for it. And I will make clear too, Pat, that my role here is as an expert in these memory techniques. It was my focus through a master's degree, and my doctoral training involved memory. But as far as the Latin Mass itself, I'm a relative novice myself. I'm 57 years old. So it was in use, during my early childhood, but I don't really have firm memories about the Latin Mass. Mm-hmm. I came back to the church at age 43, and it wasn't until a few years later that I was blessed to see Latin Masses here in my hometown of Springfield, Illinois. There are 2 churches that at least sometimes have the Latin Mass, and I was blown away by it. So I wanted to use these techniques to help other people like me get to know it better. So it was a great joy for me to read, book after book, to see the meaning and significance of the Mass, to find out what some of the great Catholic saints have had to say about the Mass and how much, they love it itself. So it's just been a joyful learning experience. And I will say also, since most of us are not well-versed in Latin, and often the Mass is said in silence, just a lower Mass. I mean, it's very, very quietly spoken. Many of the priest's words are spoken, inaudibly. So it can be hard to follow. A missal that has some pictures and has the translation is very, very helpful. And what I did, I took my missal, numbered it with these rites according to the book, so I've used the memory book to enhance the missal itself and found it to be very, very helpful and to help give joy to the Mass. But I will say one thing. If a person hasn't been to a Latin Mass, a person who loves the Lord, loves the new Mass, and if you go to one of these Masses and it's virtually silent, and you don't even for sure know exactly what's going on, you will not miss that something very special and very holy is going on. All the gestures of the priest and the servers show an amazing, reverence to God. They're facing that altar. The whole focus is upon Christ and the sacrifice He's given us. So I know actual expert. I would not call myself an expert on the Latin Mass itself, but I'm a learner, and I love the process. And I hope these memory methods will help other people learn it better along with me.
So just, and this just makes me all the more excited to attend a Latin Mass. And like I said, there's a church in our area that is being set up completely traditional all the way through. So I'll have that opportunity very soon. And I'll be spending a lot of time with your book beforehand. So when it comes to just the techniques again, when you are memorizing something of, say, a number greater than 10, probably, I really like the idea of the house, because then you can move things into different rooms. You can spread them out rather than trying to put 50 things in one room, right? That might be a little bit clustered, so to speak. But the other point that you made that I thought was useful and probably worth reiterating for whoever's listening to this is new to them is, like any skill, there's probably more work up front, right, to kind of map the house out and to memorize the house or whatever the frame of reference is that you're using. But once you have that frame set, once you have those kind of pegs in the wall, you can hang new things on them over and over again. So would it be realistic to say that this is a technique that is worth the upfront effort because it gets easier as time goes on?
Absolutely. That's a very important point. In fact, I just gave a talk on the Catholic Art of Memory over the weekend up by Chicago, and someone came and asked me that question about, boy, isn't this a lot? Isn't this very taxing to learn all these techniques? Because I gave an example I used to use when I taught college, where I would have the class generate a 50-digit random number, just have people call out numbers, we'd write them down. And then I'd say, okay, let's take a couple minutes and memorize this, and they'd all try. And when they were done, I'd say, flip our papers over, let's see how we did. And, usually a class of 30 or 40 people would putz out after about 12 words or so. But then I would go ahead and finish the string on the blackboard. Then I would turn my back to the board and say, I'm going to read them to you now. I'd start calling off numbers, and they'd go, no, Dr. Vost, you got them all wrong. And I'd say, I forgot to tell you, I'm giving these to you backwards now, okay? I'm going from, right to left. And then I would do it. And then once that was done, I'd say, okay, now somebody call out a number between 1 and 50. And somebody say 34, and I go 8. And I go up and I show them the 34th digit was an 8. So here's why I give you this example. A 50-digit number to most people and to me, if I didn't have these memory techniques, it could be a matter of hours or days mastering that. With these memory techniques, I can actually do it in a couple of minutes or so, and I used to do like a different class the next day. We'd have a completely new number. So that is the idea. There's some initial investment to learn these techniques. To me, it was fun learning them, fun practicing them. But it's so much like fitness and lifting,
I was just going to bring
take a weight that feels so hard at first, and then maybe a few months down the road, I thought that was heavy. It's a piece of cake now. The same way with these techniques. It's like building up your mental muscles. But believe me, it can be well worth your efforts that it takes at first. And part of the reason they work so well is that it does take more effort. It does take the concentration, which is one element of perfecting our memory.
And what a wonderful benefit by itself to just practice focus and concentration apart from these techniques. And I'm glad you brought up the fitness analogy. Was something that hopped into my mind right away. But I think we could probably say this of just about any skill, that it often takes a lot more effort up front to develop a skill, but then to maintain it and use it over time, it's often quite a bit easier once you've put in that investment. So I know for me, sometimes I'll see these new skills, and I'll like most people, I'll become intimidated by the amount of work that it seems to be up front. But then by drawing it to other skill sets that I've had success in or been interested before, I think it lowers that barrier to entry and makes it seem a lot more realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost everything. Hard things or excellent things are difficult and rare, but they're worth it. They're worth striving for it. And then, you have that process where it becomes automatic over time. So what at first, took me quite a while to do, now is virtually effortless because it's so ingrained. So worth the effort, especially when we're applying it to something so important like, our own faith, the parts of the Mass.
So let's talk a little bit, because in the notes here we have a mention of the last gospel from John at the end of the Latin Mass. I wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, that's one thing that struck me. When I first started going to Latin Mass, they had something called the last gospel, which was at another gospel reading at the end of every Mass, and it was always the same reading. It was from the Gospel of John, the first chapter. In the beginning was the Word, and Word was with God, and so on. And it goes on 14 verses. I thought, now this is very interesting, but I think it's just so beautiful. That's the passage where John is so clearly revealing that this Jesus Christ he's going to tell us about is God Himself, and the words are so fundamental to our faith that I thought it was just glorious that every time you go to a Latin Mass, you're going to hear that there, and it has an interesting history. It wasn't always part of the traditional Latin Mass. At some point it became a devotion that bishops and then priests would themselves do at the end of the Mass. And it was later, it was actually, I believe, Pope St. Pius V that made this part of the Tridentine Mass, or the one associated with the Council of Trent, at its time. So again, I'm just very moved every time I hear that last gospel, those words from John that are worth hearing, every time you go to a Mass. And so I have a little appendix that talks about that. And there's also just an interesting anecdote I like to tell. Being affiliated with the lay Dominicans, a great fan of St. Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Dominic, and others. And there's a story about St. Albert the Great, who was Thomas Aquinas' teacher. And this occurred in the year 1254. And it said a Bavarian member of a regular religious order had some kind of vision while praying at St. Peter's in Rome. In his vision, a monstrous serpent had writhed into the basilica with horrible hissing that filled all of Rome. It said just then a man arrived, clothed in the habit of the order of preachers, and that's the Dominicans, their black and white habit, whose name was revealed to him as Albert. It said the serpent attacked Albert, encircling him head to toe in its muscular slithering coils. Albert broke free, though, and made his way to the pulpit, whereupon he read from the Gospel of St. John up to the words, verbum caro factum est et habitavit, sorry for my poor Latin, habitavit in nobis, and the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. So that's John 1:14. So he's reading that last Gospel again. Then it said in the man's vision, at this point the serpent fled and ceased its hissing. Now it said when our great Dominican, Albert himself, arrived in Rome that same year, this man told Albert about his vision, but Albert couldn't really understand. He himself didn't know exactly what it meant. But then interestingly, 2 years later, Pope Alexander IV invited Albert to Anagni, which was the seat of the papacy at that time. As I write it, it seems that certain secular teachers from the University of Paris had been spreading venomous stories about the Dominicans and Franciscans of the university. There was a lot of, from the secular professors, they didn't like the fact that Dominicans and Franciscans were getting teaching chairs or kind of taking over. But it said St. Albert responded to their challenge and eventually sent the detractors, slithering out of town. Now here's the interesting part. The Pope was so impressed with Albert's learning and eloquence that he retained him to preach to the papal court about the Gospel of John. Verbum caro factum est et habitavit in nobis, and more. So in real life, a couple years later after this vision, the Pope invites Albert to come and speak to them about John's Gospel itself, which was featured in the vision. So I always thought that was just a cool little story.
Yeah, and your book is just filled with these fascinating little anecdotes. That's great.
Yeah, that's what. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, among that, one of the things that has me very excited to further investigate the Latin Mass and to celebrate the Latin Mass is that it's just a thought of all the great saints that celebrated it themselves. And how to to be able to participate in something that was shared with so many people that I've had the opportunity to admire and learn from their writings is just is a very exciting prospect to me as well. And I know that you had some quotations from some saints on how they feel about the Latin Mass, and I would like to hear some of those from you as well.
Sure. Yeah. And if I could give you one story, the idea too that this Mass, has such history all around the world, all throughout the centuries, even some of the most very mundane, we might think mundane, but simple parts of the Mass, even the fact of saying Amen. If I can share a story, this is from one of the ancient lives, of St. Patrick, the apostle to the Irish. This is a 5th century Druid priest forewarned their king MacNeil of a prophetic vision he had of a new faith that would arrive and live forever in Ireland. And the Druids, in the words of this ancient story, the Druids' words went like this. Taliesin, that is a Gaelic word, but meant Patrick, shall come across the stormy sea, his garment head pierced, his staff head bent, his mias, which meant altar, in the east of his house, like it is for the Latin Mass. And it said, his people shall answer, Amen, Amen. So when we utter our own amens, we can imagine the chorus of the amens that have been uttered, around the world and this country and that, we're joining in that heritage, joining in that history, for the way of nearly 2,000 years, God has been praised through the Mass.
Yeah, what an awesome and powerful thing, too. And I know there's a lot of people who go very far out of their way to participate in the Latin Mass. So again, I feel fortunate that there'll be an opportunity for me. It'll only be about 20 minutes away, not very far from the parish that I normally attend. That I'll be able to scoot up there at least every once in a while.
Yeah, exactly. And as Pope Benedict made clear in the year 2007, that they were really blessed to have our new Mass and the Latin Mass. He called them, basically different forms the new Mass called the ordinary form, the Latin Mass called the extraordinary form, but of the same rite, the holy rite of the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I think we're very fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, same rite with different expressions, I think is how he phrased it, right?
Yes. They're both, the Catholic Mass. My own background, since I actually back in the parish I belonged to as a child, which does the New Order Mass, which is what I routinely go to. But as I mentioned, there is another parish in town that on Saturday mornings offers a Latin Mass, and another in town that actually has one every day, and including one of their Sunday Masses. Oh, wow. So occasionally, I will just enjoy the spiritual benefit of also attending a Latin Mass.
Yeah, that's great. So what did the saints have to say about the Latin Mass? I'm very interested in this.
Oh, sure, and when you think about it, when you're reading any of the saints before about 1970 or so, when they're talking about just the Mass, they're speaking at that time of the Latin Mass.
Mm-hmm.
So here's one from a saint people know, Saint Francis de Sales, from his wonderful spiritual book. I mean, a true classic, Introduction to a Devout Life.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a brief quote from him: "Holy Mass is the sun, S-U-N, of all spiritual exercises, the mainspring of devotion, the soul of piety, the fire of divine charity, the abyss of divine mercy, and a precious means whereby God confers upon us His graces." I mean, boy, you can see there the burning devotion, to the gift of the Mass there at St. Francis de Sales. I'll give you another one from a saint who's probably far less well known. I didn't know about him until I started studying the Latin Mass, but his name is St. Leonard of Port Maurice, and he lived in the 18th century. And here's one quote from a beautiful little book called The Hidden Treasure, a Holy Mass. Okay, here it is. St. Leonard of Port Maurice. "Treasures, however great and precious, are never appreciated until examined, counted over, and summed up. Hence it is, dear reader, that by many there is formed no due estimate of the holy and awful," and by awful he means, awe-inspiring,
mm-hmm.
"sacrifice of the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
Though the greatest treasure which glories and enriches the Church of God, it is still a hidden treasure and known to few." Then he says, "If this jewel of paradise were but known, who would not give up all things to obtain it?" So I thought, wow, that is a glorious quote. And I think, how many of us truly, or even know the new Mass if we came up with that just at the very surface level. There's such treasures buried within the Mass that we do well to know it deeper. And I love even when he talks about examining it, counting it, summing it up, I think in a way he's encouraging us to know it by number, to know it in order, to know it backwards and forwards.
And one of the things of Aquinas that always stuck with me too were the accounts of him weeping during the Mass. That image has always struck me very deeply, and has continued to more and more as I've continued to understand and appreciate the Mass myself.
Oh, that's a great point you make up, Pat, because, some people who know St. Thomas Aquinas, know him, of course, as this great philosopher and reasoner, and we don't want to, caricature him into being like a Mr. Spock, a person who denies emotion or anything. Oh, in fact, I did find there was actually a science fiction story from the 1950s that features a robot they drew parallels with St. Thomas with. This robot actually was programmed for perfect reason, and it deduced, like Thomas, from the evidence of its sensory data, that there must be a God, and according to the story, it went around trying to convert people to Christ. But anyway, the bottom line is that yes, Thomas was this great master of reason and devotee of truth, but his emotions burst forth in that sacrifice of the Mass. He wasn't just a thinker; he was a lover. He loved Christ. He loved the Mass. So I think that is a very telling image about St. Thomas. I mean, in a sense, it was his striving for deeper and deeper understanding and knowledge that helped fire his great love for Christ and the Mass.
Yeah, and of all the things that I've gleaned from St. Thomas, which are too many to, well, I would need to use some of your memory techniques to even count them out. That is something that has I've come to appreciate more and more and more. Is he was not just a robot of reason. This is a man who was deeply passionate about his relationship with Christ and his devotion to the church, right until the very end too, which is just so much to be learned from him, which is why. I love reading so much of your stuff, because you from the 1 Minute Aquinas, and then How to Think Like Aquinas, which we were talking about, is coming out soon. But for this book specifically, because I think I heard some whispers earlier today when we were organizing it that it should be coming out fairly soon. Is that correct?
I believe so. I don't know the exact time, but it should be my next book out, How to Memorize the Latin Mass. Very, just again, very, very excited about it. And I really hope it will help just, the general Catholic. Maybe you go to a new Mass, but you're intrigued, you want to know more, you want to dig in. I hope they'll find that helpful. And for people who are devotees of the traditional Latin Mass, maybe they're raising their children or helping their grandchildren, learn that Mass in particular, I hope that will be helpful. I hope it will supplement the Missal. I hope it will supplement other instruction and help, in a way, fire up their love for the Masses as they build in their knowledge base.
Yeah, well, they've certainly been helpful for me. So, before this book comes out, and as soon as it does, everybody please go to enroutebooksandmedia.com. That's where it will become available. I would highly encourage people to start with your other ones and memorize the faith and memorize the Mass, because even just building some of the skills with those will make the transition easier for when Memorize the Latin Mass comes out, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like that training, like we talked about, the physical training. You get in shape with those, it'll make this all the easier.
So if you don't have those books already, they are all available on Amazon. And then again, keep your eyes out on En Route Books and Media for Memorize the Latin Mass. Dr. Vost, thank you so much for taking the time and talking about this with me.
My pleasure, Pat.
Talk soon.
God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.